Welcome. So what we're going to talk about today is how to give feedback to your employees. Now, this is one of the more difficult things that people have a problem with. Now, the reason why people have so much trouble with it is simply because it takes a little bit more emotional intelligence and it's uncomfortable, right? Because we have to have tough conversations with our employees. And so there's a lot of, owners, a lot of managers that won't actually have the tough conversations because they're afraid of how people will react, or they're going to be afraid that they might not say the right thing. They don't want to upset people. They're afraid that they're going to take it the wrong way. So all of these things happen pretty frequently as far as why people don't give feedback. But what I'm going to show you today is how to do it where there is very little chance of that happening and how to handle it if it does. So number one, there's a few ways that people give feedback normally. One method is called the shit sandwich, which I'm not a fan of. So the shit sandwich, as it's called, is you start with a compliment like, hey, I love the way that you make these orders. It's awesome. Then you put in the negative or piece of feedback, but you're always late. And then the third piece is, but I love how upbeat you are when you're here on shift. And so then I just find that the employee is sometimes like, okay, is it really that serious if you've given me so much, positive feedback and stuff like that? Is it really that serious an issue? They might not take it as seriously. Or what it could do is train them to think every time you give them a compliment that they're going to hear something negative after. And we never want that to be the case. So the way that I prefer to give feedback, a couple rules that I follow. Number one, when I'm giving feedback, I do it in private. So, I will just bring someone to the side. I don't necessarily give feedback to someone when there's other people around. I might say like, hey, can we chat for a quick sec? I'll just use an example of maybe mopping the floor, for example. So, hey, when you mop the floor, I noticed that you didn't quite get in the corners there. Was there anything unclear about how to mop the floor? And so you just kind of asked a question like, I'm busy doing stuff, or I was just trying to get it done quick. And then you say, yeah, no worries, totally get it. I just want to make sure you know that we need to get into the corners when we're mopping the floor every time. The reason we need to do that is because there could be pests that become issues, or there could be, dirt that gets there and then a customer sees it. And we want to make sure all of our customers come in and the floor is clean and everything's looking great. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. High five, fist bump, whatever you want to do as an ending to that. I'd be like, awesome. So let's make sure that gets done in the future. Awesome, man. Keep up the great work. And then you end it on a positive note like that. So it doesn't deter from the seriousness of the discussion. It still keeps it light. Most feedback is usually done within 30 to 60 seconds. It doesn't take that long to do it, but we want to reiterate a couple things. Number one, what the standard was. Number two, that they're not meeting the standard. And then number three, why that standard is important, right? So now how this will differ is that all of a sudden, if this person still continues the same behavior pattern, then the conversation starts to change. So then the second time we bring something up, and again, it has to be the same issue. So it can't be like one day they're late, then the next day they don't mop the floor properly. We can't escalate both of those things. It has to be the same thing that we talk about. So for example, in the next piece of feedback we'd give to someone, we'd say, hey, so remember how we talked about getting the corners in the floor? I've noticed that didn't happen again. What's up with that? And so you're just seeking to understand in this second conversation. Oh, okay, so yeah, you're busy or whatever. I get that, but that still needs to get done. I want to make sure that's clear that it's not acceptable not to get in the corners when you're mopping the floor. Is that clear? Are we all understanding that? Okay, perfect. So next time I'm going to check up on this, and I just want to see those corners done. Okay. And so you notice my tone is still not angry by any means, but we've basically then conveyed a more seriousness. Now, the third time around, because the second feedback that you've given, that counts as a verbal warning. Now the next piece of this becomes a little bit more stern. And so then we're like, hey, so we've talked twice about not getting in the corners when you mop the floor. Do you remember why that's important? Okay. So if you continue not to do this, that's basically not doing a part of your job, right? And so if you continue to do this, we're not going to be able to have you on this team any longer. Is that what you want? And so this is where we start getting into, okay, so, this is officially a written warning. So the next time this happens, we won't be able to have you on the team anymore. And so, again, we want to do it in a way that we are not angry. We are not, yelling at someone. We are not emotional when we do it, although usually when we want to give feedback is when we're emotional. So we need to make sure that we're calm when we're doing it. And so this just conveys in a very logical way the issue that needs to be addressed. Okay. And so it doesn't have to be a big thing. It just has to be clear. One of the most common things that happens is people often don't give feedback quick enough. So they might see something that happens, they don't mention it, and then a week goes by and it's still happening. And in your mind, you're like, oh my God, this has been a week this is happening. In the mind of the employee, they're like, that's just normal. They don't realize they're doing anything wrong. So sometimes we then come to them and say, it's been a week that you've been doing this. Why are you doing it like that? And we actually create more of an issue with people because of the way that we're framing it, because we view it one way and they don't view it that way. We're trying to make sure there's clarity there, right? Or another common thing is people will come up and say, hey, I talked to you about this last month and it's still going on. How come you haven't fixed that? It needs to be consistent, and you can't wait a month to then give feedback again, because again, in that person's mind, no news is good news, right? So when we're giving feedback, that is some of the most important things, is to make sure that it's quick. We address the issue. We state why it's important. Based on the number of times you're giving that feedback, we do get more serious with it and a little bit stronger with our tonality. But at the end of the day, we also want to do it in private. And we also want to make sure we're documenting the conversations that we have with people, because if you ever go to terminate someone, there's typically some, it bodes well for you, is should any legal issues arise, that you did give them feedback. So someone could say, oh, well, they never told me that I was, that getting in the corners was an issue. And then you could say, well, actually, we talked about it on this date at this time. And then we have a written warning here that I brought out, and here's the written warning, blah, blah, blah. And so we have talked about it, and this is the documentation of it. So those are the things we want to make sure we're having in place from a feedback perspective. Now, the other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is when people take feedback improperly, or when they, have too many excuses. So a common one, this is just one that happens, within my restaurant sometimes, is someone will be late and will say, hey, so you're 10 minutes late. So yeah, what happened there? What prevented you from getting to work on time? Oh, well, the bus. Okay. No, totally get that. The buses sometimes are delayed. So to ensure that this doesn't happen again, what are you going to do differently? Now, this is a powerful question that I like to use, because then the onus is on them to figure out, oh, okay, well, I need to do something differently. And then say someone says something like, oh, well, the bus will just be on time next time. I'm like, okay, and what if it isn't? Oh, well, I don't know. Oh, is there perhaps an earlier bus that you can take? You'd be a few minutes earlier. Oh, yeah, I guess I could do that. So what we want to do is we want to take a look through some of their excuses, if you will, and just get them to understand that their behavior pattern needs to change, right? And so what often happens, people say, oh, well, this happened or that happened, or so-and-so didn't do what they were supposed to do. Okay, but let's focus now again on what you did. You were supposed to do this. And so, tell me more about how that didn't get done. Now the other caveat I will say is that if there is something that is legitimately in their way, say for example, you're short-staffed and you're down a couple people, well, then all of a sudden, yeah, that might mean that standards aren't as high as what they normally should be. So that would be saying to me, like, okay, I understand why you didn't do that. I just want to let you know that, hey, this is the standard, but I understand that, things happen and you did your best. So let's focus on solving that problem, which is the short staffing, rather than their performance. So if there's ever a reason, like, say if they're not filling up the beverage cooler, for example, or whatever the case might be, but they're out of that particular product to stock, then obviously it's not their fault. So we always want to look at that first as well, just to see if maybe some things are legitimate. But at the end of the day, when we give feedback to people, if I had to go back and tell every single person on this earth how to give feedback, I would say address it quickly, because no news is good news in the eyes of the employee. Number two, do it calmly and logically. Number three, I would state the issue clearly, state why that is important, and then I would end on a positive note. And usually that positive note is, okay, now let's go and make sure this gets done. Okay, I'm going to look for it. So, I want to see how well you do this next time, and I'm hoping to give you a high five when you do it. So always leave on a positive note so that it's upbeat. But at the end of the day, if their behavior doesn't change, that's when our communication should differ, right? I find a lot of people, when their communication doesn't differ, they end up fixing it themselves. They end up doing things themselves. They end up picking up the slack for people, and they never actually get the people to change. And so say, for example, if an employee was late every day for 3 weeks, and eventually you come in and you fire them and say, you were late for 3 weeks in a row. I'm done with you. I've been picking up your slack and staying late. You're fired. They will probably look at you and go, oh my God, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't realize that was a problem. Then you and your brain are probably thinking, well, how could you not know that wasn't a problem? Or like, how could you not know that? But the reality is that our obligations as leaders is to make sure that our expectations are clear, they are reinforced, and we give feedback quickly so that there's no misinterpretation. So if I ever have to fire someone, they will know it's coming. They will know exactly what they're not performing about, and they never have to worry about where they stand with me. I will tell them exactly where they stand, because by doing so, we then put the ball in their court. Then they can change things, right? Because if we don't, they just don't know, and they can never correct that behavior. And we run the risk of letting a potentially good person go for something that they didn't necessarily know was an issue or not. So, giving feedback, do not be afraid of it. It is part of what you need to do. If you need to practice it in role play, you can do that. But just make sure it's quick. Typically, 30 to 60 seconds is very normal for quick feedback. And that's the best way to do it. And if you do a lot of feedback quickly and as things are happening, you likely won't have to do nearly as much of the big conversations and those types of things. You can give feedback quickly and make sure people know where they stand. And that's the best thing to do. All right, guys. Hopefully this was helpful. We'll chat soon.